Hello, BookTube. Well, it's a bleak and barren Sunday once again, and not only a bleak and barren Sunday, but the bleakest and most barrenest Sunday of them all. I get nothing free, no books in the mail today, not just by will of the federal government, but also by the design of baby Jesus, who once again gets in my way. So I thought I'd console myself with a tag. and I have them a fantastic tag to help me through. It's the Star Trek book tag. It was created by J.D. Archer, who, when he makes a tag, really makes a tag. And it's six Star Trek related questions. I wish it had been 600. And when I was thinking about my answers, I briefly considered making all of my answers Star Trek books, since I've read them all. But then I thought, would that be entertaining to anybody else? Even other Star Trek fans probably haven't read all the books. So I didn't do that. But we start off with number one, Star Trek the Original Series, a corny but entertaining book. This will be the first occasion in which I disagree with JD. Star Trek the Original Series is not corny. I don't know how anyone could think that. It's a mystery to me. And I don't like mysteries. They give me a bellyache, and I've got a beauty right now. But he made the tag. So he sets the rules. In the description, corny but entertaining, I would the first thing that came to mind was A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs, the very first of his successful books, and the very first of his successful magazine series, a story in which John Carter, a U.S. cavalryman in the middle of the 19th century, is mysteriously transported to the planet Mars, to Barsoom, where the lighter gravity gives him superpowers. It makes him essentially Superman. He can leap fantastic distances. He's stronger, faster. And he encounters one exotic civilization after another on the planet Barsoom, and it's all just incredibly good. He is probably Edgar Rice Burroughs' most corny character, and that's saying a lot. And as the series goes on, he's fond of getting into the tightest of tight spots with all of his various sword-wielding comrades, and just when everything seems worst, saying, "I still live." Princess of Mars, has been overshadowed, of course, because Edgar Rice Burroughs then went on to create Tarzan. And if you create Tarzan, nothing else that you do is going to be remembered as well. And it's unfortunate, because Princess of Mars and all the Barsoom books are such good fun. They're just so wonderful. And also far more effective science fiction than they're given credit. Question number two is The Next Generation. JD's prompt is a sequel that's better than the original. This also is an occasion for me to disagree with the creator of the tag. Honored be his name. The Next Generation is not in any way better than the original Star Trek. It's not as well written, it's certainly not as well acted, and it's also most especially not anywhere near as entertaining. When the original Star Trek Enterprise, NCC 1701, no bloody A, B, C, or D, encounters a malevolent space being, they shoot at it and maybe try to understand it once they've wounded it and it can't hurt anyone. When the Enterprise D encounters such a thing, first of all, it starts to batter their shields and hull and cause hull breaches that cause crew members to go flying off into the vacuum and die. And after about 15 solid minutes of that, the empath on the bridge says, "I sense hostility." Thanks. That's great. We'll go to you when we need breaking news. And then what happens? Well, you've got a ship that's under assault. You've got crew members being sucked out into hard vacuum. There's only one thing you could possibly do. Go into the ready room and have a 15-minute long discussion. I hate to break this to you. I'm sure that age demographic wise, all of you think this is heresy, so I hate to break it to you, but The Next Generation is poop. But again, honoring JD's prompt, even though I don't agree with it, the one that I wanted to pick, a sequel that's better than the original, is something I mentioned on this channel before. I want to plug it again. I'm not even sure that it's still in print, but you can find it. The author is Stephen R. Donaldson, and it's a fantasy series that he wrote called The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever. And the first book that he wrote in that series was called Lord Foul's Bane, and it's an explicit Tolkien knockoff in every way, and except that the main character is a leper. And by that, I don't mean that he likes the wrong Spice Girl. I mean he's a physical leper in the 20th century. He has leprosy. He managed to contract it, and he has to live with it every day. And when you learn a lot about it, it's one of the ineptitudes of the book is that the first 40 pages are a diagnostic manual on leprosy rather than the introduction to a fantasy novel. But he gets transported to a land called the Land. There's a fantasy land, the usual type quasi-medieval thing with a large host of fantasy beings. And it turns out that in the land, his white gold wedding ring is suddenly a nexus of unimaginable power, and it's linked to him. So he all of a sudden becomes, much against his will, a figure of extreme significance to the people of the land in their fight against the eponymous Lord Foul. And the book it's got moments here and there, but it's largely a dud. And then the sequel came out, The Ill-Earth War. At the end of Lord Foul's Bane, Thomas Covenant is transported back to Earth, and it turns out at the beginning of the Ill-Earth War, when he manages to be transported back to the land again, it turns out in one of the first of the interesting twists that time passes much faster in the land than it does in Thomas Covenant's Earth. So a lot of the characters that he knew in the original book are now much older, and a whole new cast of characters taking their place, and war is brewing. And the Ill-Earth War is a smash of a success. What a book. There are 3 protracted climax scenes, so they're talking 30, 40 pages each one of which is worth the price of admission, and you get 3 of them in the one book. It bears no resemblance whatsoever to the dramatic failures of the book that preceded it, so it definitely gets my vote. Question number 3 is Deep Space Nine. A book or series with a great ensemble cast. Now, this I completely agree. JD points out that Deep Space Nine was the first Star Trek series in which we don't go anywhere. Deep Space Nine, the title of the series, is the name of a space station orbiting the planet Bajor. And the reason that it becomes the nexus of the whole story is because Bajor is very nearby, the closest planet, to a stable wormhole to another part of the galaxy. Not a wormhole that pops up and then vanishes like the one in the original Star Trek movie, but an actual passageway, a large passageway between that spot and another part of the galaxy. So it becomes absolutely crucial. And the space station becomes the locus of all of the activity. Now, the creators of the show eventually realized after a few seasons that was feeling like a bit of a hindrance, so they gave the captain of Deep Space Nine his own starship, a small space vessel. It's not a big ship of the line Starfleet vessel, but it's really interesting, and it allowed them to go places and have spacefaring adventures as well, always tethered to the station. I think the show is really, really good, and it was also because the station was stationary. The show became a nexus for the writers to paint Star Trek history as it was happening on a very broad scale. Something that if you're on a ship and you're hopping from galaxy to galaxy, or from solar system to solar system, you can't do that. You can only echo the history that's going on back home, but you can't really take part in it. And Deep Space Nine eventually started embracing that, took advantage of that. And the book with the great ensemble cast, that's a really tough one. But just recently, I'll put a note in the information down below. Just recently, there was a beautiful paperback reprint of a book called The English. It's a nonfiction book. It's 1,000 pages long. Now, don't turn off the video. It's a nonfiction book, and it's 1,000 pages long. It's a narrative history of England, and it is really, really good. It really doesn't have a dud page in it. I firmly believe that if the subject of the English interests you, and who doesn't it, you could read it and like it, no matter how long it is. And it's a rare instance in which the paperback reprint is actually much prettier than the hardcover, and also very sturdy. So the paperback is one of the rare times where I'm recommending the purchase of a paperback. Then we go on to number 4, which is Voyager, Star Trek Voyager. My beloved Voyager, a book or series featuring an epic journey. And those of you who aren't familiar with Star Trek, the reason for that is because the USS Voyager is a starship in Starfleet. You hate to call it ordinary, but an ordinary starship in Starfleet, captained by Catherine Janeway. And an incident in the first episode flings it across the galaxy. Now, even with Star Trek technology, with warp technology, which allows the ships to travel in warp space faster than the speed of light, even with that technology, there are limits. And the ship is flown so far across the galaxy that, as they quickly realize, it will take them 70 years to get back home at maximum warp. Which means that the very youngest human crew members might still be alive, and of course the Vulcan weapons officer, Mr. Tuvok, will still be alive, but no one else will be. The ship automatically the drama becomes getting home. Somehow finding a way to get home before those 70 years are over, to cut that journey short. And it's amazing. The Voyager has had some of the 7 years of Voyager have featured some of the very worst single Star Trek episodes of any series ever. But the best of Voyager is tremendously good. Just incredibly, I have affectionate memories of the best of Voyager. And for an epic journey, there's a book called Journeyer by Gary Jennings. I think I've mentioned it on this channel before. It's an old historical novel about Marco Polo and his trip to Asia. And his time in the court of the Great Khan, and his adventures there, and his trip back home, when he has been changed. He is an alien being now. And the book is big, and it uses its length very cannily, because you feel like you have gone through these adventures with Marco Polo, and you feel changed when you get back to the odd ways of Europe. I don't think Journeyer is still in print anymore, but like with other books that I mentioned on this channel, it's one of the ones where you can certainly find it at one of those cheesy paperback used bookstores. It had a very, very healthy print run in paperback, so you can probably find it. And again, as always, if you can't find it, you let me know. I can certainly find it. Number 5 is Star Trek Enterprise, and JD's prompt is a book with a bad ending, and I chuckled when I saw that, because it's one of the few things that pretty much all Star Trek fans can agree on, is that the final episode of Star Trek Enterprise, the show that killed Star Trek on network TV, didn't have 7 seasons, was canceled. So young people who had grown up with the Next Generation and watched Deep Space Nine and watched Voyager tuned into Star Trek Enterprise and got to experience something that those of us who've been around from the beginning had already experienced once, which is our show being canceled after only a handful of seasons, despite anything that we might say or do, because the ratings just weren't there. And inexplicably, the writers of Star Trek Enterprise knew well ahead of time that their show was going to be canceled. So they used their last season to do some storytelling that you can only do when you essentially don't care about ratings anymore. They did 3-part episodes. No one does a 3-part episode on a weekly TV show. And they did, to very good effect. They did 2-part episodes. They did big, broad episodes that were really, really good. Some of the best Star Trek shows there are. And then, for some unknown reason, in the last episode, they completely dropped the ball. The last episode, I don't want to give it away for those of you who haven't seen it, but it features a narrative gimmick that ought not to have crossed the writer's mind for even a second. And if it did, they should immediately have dismissed it as a disservice to the loyal fans who'd been watching all along, and instead they embraced it. Anyway, I agree with JD completely. It's a terrible, terrible ending. And when it comes to bad endings in books, well, I've mentioned quite a few of them on this channel. For instance, Peter Benchley's Jaws. It is a very, very satisfying climax, but the very ending, the ending of the book, the true climax of the book has to be Brody versus the shark. It has to be. and caught up in the bigger, more Moby Dick style subplot that Peter Benchley has hauled on and done a fantastic job with. He forgets that, and only remembers it in the last 10 pages of the book. So the confrontation between Brody and the shark at the end of the book is, to put it mildly, anticlimactic. There's also the climax or the conclusion to Thomas Harris's Hannibal, which I've mentioned many times on this channel as perhaps the worst ending to any book ever. But the one I had in mind this time around is Stephen King. Now, I'm no fan. Stephen King doesn't do anything right, including endings. But the one that I thought was particularly egregious was Under the Dome, which wasn't that bad a book, especially, on the sliding scale of Stephen King, who writes at the level of an 8th grader. So, a not bad 8th grade book, I guess, is what we could call it. It's fairly involving, but it's incredibly long. It's 1,000 pages long. And if you write a book that's 1,000 pages long, you are extra behooved to give it a good ending for your readers who've gone through that much. And instead, oh my God, you Stephen King fans out there, you have to agree with me. The ending to Under the Dome. It's bad. Let's just leave it at that. It's bad. And then the last one that JD did was Discovery. And he called it your most anticipated release of the future, because Star Trek Discovery is about to come out on network TV, and I've read everything there is to read about it, and I've heard all the on-set stories and the casting and whatnot, and it's going to stink. It's going to be really, really bad. And the worst part of it, the way it's going to stink, is that nobody's going to know that. People are going to look at it. It's going to stink in a J.J. Abrams way. It's going to stink in the way that the J.J. Abrams movies did, where people who knew nothing about Star Trek went to see the movies and said that was really good. And a Star Trek fan watching it would say, no, it wasn't. It really, really wasn't. It was the opposite of really good. And it also wasn't Star Trek. And the same thing is going to be true for Star Trek Discovery. It is going to be a science fiction show with Star Trek slapped on it and some pointy ears. Unless I'm very much mistaken, it's going to be something that Star Trek fans, especially dyed-in-the-wool. JD, if you're watching, we have to compare notes when we finally see it. I would be willing to bet that when you watch it, your reaction is going to be, well, that was interesting, and it's going to get a lot of people watching and talking about something called Star Trek, but the ethos, the ideals, the continuity, the texture, wasn't Star Trek at all. It wasn't anything like. I could be wrong. We'll see. But since I consider Star Trek Discovery to be a looming disaster, when I was looking forward at the books that are coming in 2017 that I want to recommend to you, I naturally thought along the lines of looming disasters. And oh, have I got a book for you. It's by Bruce Beveridge, and it's called Titanic, the Ship Magnificent. It's a beautiful 2-volume slipcase. Let me see if I can get that. Yeah, there we go. Deal with the glare there. It's a 2-volume slipcase it's a celebration of what Titanic was, the mind-numbing luxury of the thing. For once, it's not necrophiliac. For once, it's a book about the Titanic that's about the Titanic in sunlight, the Titanic for her brief window of being alive, instead of being entirely about her death. So you see, it's a book that goes through the schematics and the prices and all of the promotional pictures and shows you the luxury involved in the ship. Not just the luxury that the passengers would see, but also the luxury of the cutting-edge technology of the thing, the luxury that the crew and the operating people would have seen. It's amazing. As I've mentioned to a couple of people now, it is, if you are a fan of Titanic, if you have that shelf in your collection of Titanic books, this is one you have to have. And like I said, the most refreshing thing about it is that it's not about the death of the Titanic. It's about the life of the Titanic. But still, when you're reading this book, the iceberg is looming. It's being calved off of its home glacier the whole time that this thing is being built, in the same way that Star Trek Discovery is being calved right now in a studio near you. Anyway, that's it. That is the Star Trek book tag. Thank you very much for tagging me, JD. And I tag Rich Bruna, who just joined us on BookTube. I tag Britta. Do you have Star Trek where you are? I tag Garden Scriptorium. Oh my God! If you're not a Star Trek fan, the answers will be even better. And I tag Reading with Pugs, who I suspect of being a Next Generation fan, but we'll work on that. And I tag Cam at Wolfshop Publishing. Because I'm assuming they have Star Trek in Australia. And thank you much. I'll see you soon, BookTube.